Hey folks, this is Grease Scotsman. This Marrow SDK level authoring tutorial will focus on creating and using zones with zone events and zone load level components. Zone events trigger an action or event when a valid entity or object enters or exits their collider bounds. They are one of the ways the level designer can convey that the environment is reacting to the player's choices and actions. For example, zones with zone events can execute a public mono behavior method, like calling spawnable on a crate spawner set in manual mode. By default, crate spawners will activate the moment the linked zone they reside in is triggered. Using manual mode paired with a zone event that calls spawnable on a null body crate spawner allows the level designer to have full control over when that enemy spawns into the level. You can also toggle properties of game objects, like setting a real-time light to enabled to provide a red alert status if a player trips an alarm. The player need not be the only activator. In an upcoming demonstration, you'll see how the OnZoneExit action of a zone event is used to ensure a chain of events is triggered if the player tries to grab a gun, even if they force grab it from far away. You can also force a configurable joint to break or alter other values, so a teetering, rickety bridge crumbles just after the player makes it across. Zone events let you disable entire game objects, like removing a force field that's blocking progress. But by using the permissions system creatively, the barrier will only drop if the player uses a specific item to trigger the zone. You can quickly create zones with zone events using the game object MarrowSDK Zone Event menu. Zones with zone events often have their own colliders and reside within the bounds of linked zones. However, it is perfectly fine for zones with zone links to share their trigger colliders with zone events, all on the same game object. Zone events have their own set of activator permissions, so while they may share a trigger collider with other zone-related components, you will need to set permissions appropriately. As a reminder, zone activators can be any mixture of bone tag data cards or crates. Examples in the upcoming demo use the player, a list of viable items, and even a mix of the two to ensure that events trigger only when they should. Once you have the zone event created and have set permissions, you need to add the action that takes place when the zone event is triggered. There are 3 listeners available to control this. OnZoneEnter. This action is triggered anytime a valid activator enters the zone. The OnZoneEnterOneShot is the same as OnZoneEnter, but happens only once. If any valid activator enters the bounds of the zone after its one shot is spent, no action is taken. When a valid activator exits the zone, the OnZoneExit action will trigger. Keep in mind that multiple actions can be triggered for each listener, as will be seen in the upcoming examples. Zone load level triggers a level change when a valid activator, usually the player, enters the collider volume. However, if you wanted to set up an interesting victory or fail condition, you could create a race between the player and an enemy using zones with 2 load level components. Set the permissions of one load level to be activated by the player. This would progress them to the next level normally. However, you can set up the other zone load level to only permit the enemy crate spawner, meaning if any enemy that matches the spawner reaches their zone load level, the player could be sent to a different level entirely, adding consequences for failure. The load screen level field specifies the loading screen area that the player will see during the level loading process. The external BoneLab core palette includes the load mod and load default level crates for this purpose. If you decide to make something homegrown, this loading screen level should be a very visually simple, small area with very few assets that is walled in so that the player cannot fall. Some form of loading progress, like an animated status image, or text that conveys that the level load process is underway, is recommended. The level field accepts any level crate found in the asset warehouse. And now for the fun stuff. We'll begin by watching a short sequence and then walk through all of the zone events used in the clip step by step. Zone events, to me, are all about conveying to the player that their actions have consequences. One of the hard parts when designing some sort of level action is that you can never assume how different players are going to behave. So, start with a goal for your event. In this case, I wanted an alarm light to go off, some enemies to spawn, the zone ambience to change, but only when the gun was actually removed from the table. Now, if I simply surrounded the area around the table, or maybe even half of the room with a trigger collider and set the zone event's permissions to the player, I would be making a number of assumptions about player actions, and there's a good chance that players would either manage to get the gun without triggering the alarm, or they'd trigger the alarm just by walking around the room. Instead, I want the alarm to go off only when the gun is picked up. To solve this, rather than the player being the triggering activator, there's a small zone with a zone event that has nothing in its bone tags section, but lists the Eater22 in its crates list. Note that the AND operator is set here very purposefully. If the OR operator was used, then rigid bodies without a bone tag or the gun would trigger the event. Using AND logic with an empty bone tag list means bone tags by themselves won't cause a match. The listed crate items are also required. So that solves the permissions problem. The next issue is to make sure that the event consistently gets activated. The Eater22 is going to spawn inside the zone with the zone event. This means that we only want to take action when the gun exits the zone event's bounds. When that happens, we take the following actions. We turn on an intense red real-time light to signal an alert or alarm status. Next, we enable an animator on that real-time light to cause it to spin on its y-axis. Finally, we spawn a null body nearby. An advanced feature of zones with zone links is that you can nest zones with zone links within each other. In this case, two smaller zones with zone links reside within the main room's zone link bounds. They act as a cage for the Eater22 and have it as their valid activator. As the gun leaves the table, it will enter these nested zone links, which trigger a zone ambience change that plays a looping alarm buzz. The next zone event interaction involves a rickety bridge. This is a series of rigid bodies held together by fixed joints and anchored to a kinematic block under the far side of the bridge. This block, being immovable, keeps one end of the bridge supported. The individual pieces of the bridge are spaced apart slightly so that they move freely. The brake force is set to allow the weight of the player to interact with the bridge pieces, but they don't actually break under normal circumstances. However, the brake forces are weak enough for the player's weight to destabilize them and sink them partially. As the player crosses the bridge, they enter a zone with a zone event that spawns a null body. There is another zone event on the other side of the bridge that sets the brake forces of all of the bridge pieces to 0. This zone event has activation permissions of the null body or the player. This means that if the player ignores this enemy or crosses the bridge too slowly, the null body can reach the trigger before the player and drop them into the abyss. However, since the player is also an activator of this zone event, once they do reach the other side, the bridge will collapse, cutting off any chance of retreat. Finally, we come to the force field that prevents the player from exiting the level. A series of items in destructible boxes are strewn about. A small pedestal acts as a receptacle for a proper offering. There are two zone events with sphere colliders that fit the pedestal that will trigger depending on the item that gets placed into it. One zone event has no bone tags listed, and the AND operator is set. A list of bad crate spawner items are the valid activators. If a rigid body that doesn't match one of these crates, like a cardboard box, is placed on the pedestal, nothing happens. However, if one of these bad items is placed on the pedestal, 4 null bodies will spawn and a red light will turn on to give the player feedback that they have made a mistake. To ensure that only the desired light is enabled, the success light is forced off, just in case it happens to be on. All of these actions take place on OnZoneEnter, so that the player can try multiple items and get proper feedback each time. In this zone event's OnZoneExit, the failure light that was triggered gets turned off, signaling to the player that the offending item has been removed from the pedestal. The other zone event is the success trigger. This zone event permits only the Apollo crate. It uses the OnZoneEnterOneShot action to enable a green light and removes the Forcefield game object, allowing the player to progress. Since Apollo is the only valid activator, the OnZoneExit action turns off the green success light in case the Apollo item is removed from the pedestal. The event also forces the red light off anytime the Apollo item enters the bounds of the trigger, just in case you try to stack multiple items. This showcases but a glimpse of what is possible with zones with zone events. The next major topic in this MarrowSDK level authoring tutorial series dives headfirst into the advanced feature of scene chunks. See you in the void.